Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows. My special guest this week is comedian Shecky Greene. Shecky invited me over to his home, which I found out is just blocks from where I live here in Palm Springs. We sat down and he said, "Hey, how would you like to have something to eat?" So we spent about an hour eating combination fried rice and talking about his career. And I suddenly realized, wait a minute, I didn't have a tape running. So we had to start everything over again. So Shecky's my guest, but I'm his guest here in his home. And Shecky, thanks for taking the time to spend this evening with us and for the fried rice. One of the things I noticed in driving up to the house is that your house number is 1642.
Yes.
And I couldn't figure out why that rang a bell till I realized that when I was a kid, before we went to 254-1160, they gave us 7-digit numbers. That was my parents' phone number.
I know. I used to call your house all the time.
Were you the one who talked to my mother?
Yes. Your mother was wonderful.
She certainly was. Your real name is Fred Sheldon Greenfield.
Yes, and then they changed it in the Navy. They switched it around some way. It became Sheldon Fred Greenfield. And all the time I was in the Navy, I kept on saying to them, I was Sheldon Fred Greenfield. I kept on saying, you're 7272791, you know?
Okay.
We became a number. That was my number in the service. And later on, I got a number 64923. That was my police number when I was arrested in Vegas.
What I'm wondering, though, I read that you officially didn't change your name till recently, actually.
After I got married to Marie, we talked about it and everything else, and something happened. Some kid put out a magazine, the SHECKY GREENE magazine. And I said to her, you know, they're using my name, and when they, on television shows, it was identified, I don't know why. I mean, it had really nothing to do with me. It's just Shecky identified, the name Shecky identified with comedy. So a lot of comedy shows would say, you're trying to be a Shecky, you know, whatever that meant. You know, nobody called me and said, could we use your name or anything? So finally I said to my wife, well, let's go down and change my name, you know. And we went down and changed her name. And then the kid from the magazine called me and says, you're not going to sue me, are you? You know.
I know that so many people in the public eye have very different names. I mean, Shecky Greene, Sheldon Greenfield, not too much of a change. But you take Roy Rogers, who was Leonard Sly, you know, growing up.
Yeah, riding on a horse like that, he didn't look like a Leonard Sly.
No, he didn't. And I remember in that wonderful This Is Your Life, Roy Rogers, they brought his mother on in a wheelchair, and she kept calling him Leonard. And it just felt so odd to see that. Did you ever meet Roy Rogers?
Yes. I met Roy and Dale after they got married. His wife, Linda, died, and she was a very good friend of Linda's, Dale, and then they were very much in love, and they got married. And they had children, Dale and Roy, but they also adopted children, a lot of kids.
You speak about Roy Rogers. I must tell you, and I must tell the audience, it's such a thrill to finally meet you and realize you live 3 blocks from me. But and we've run into each other at the grocery. But the other thing is the fact that I always thought you did the best Gabby Hayes voice.
Well, I don't know whether I can still do it, but Gabby Hayes came aboard our ship one time. I'll never forget that. I never saw so many people so excited.
I just want to say there, Roy, I mean that, you know, people think I got no teeth and everything, but I got them here. And I tell you, Dale, I just, I just want you all to be singing there.
Well, you know, I saw him on television at the Academy Awards one year, and they put the name underneath, George Gabby Hayes, and he had on a white tuxedo and teeth.
And he was good looking. He was a fairly good looking man.
Handsome older guy. Yeah.
Chester in Gunsmoke.
Gunsmoke, radio or television?
No, I'm talking about television.
Okay, Dennis Weaver.
Dennis Weaver was one, and then after Dennis Weaver left, the other one.
Ken Curtis played Festus.
Absolutely, Ken Curtis,
who has a close tie to Roy Rogers. As having been, I don't know whether he was in Sons of the Pioneers or what, but he was a singer, a country western singer also, which is essentially what Roy was at the beginning.
I'll tell you, when I was a kid, my brother and I, my mother would work and should work late on Saturdays, and we were in Chicago. We used to listen to WLS, and there was a country western, barn dance show, and there was Uncle Ezra, there was Lulabelle and Skyland Scotty, and all of these people, and not like it is today, the kind of music the kids like today.
Music? Did you say music?
Well,
I know. You got to call it something.
I want to tell you that I went to school, and they told me a certain rule, and I wasn't having any fun, so I went out and I bought a gun. And this is what I said. And my father came in, and I shot him dead. They got me in jail now. I got 1 to 10, but if I've ever let out, I'm going to do it again. I mean, that's a song that would win a gold bracelet.
Sure, absolutely. Well, Steve Allen told me he had a phrase he'd always use in an interview. He said, Rhapsody in Blue is much preferred to Switchblade Baby, I'm going to stab you tonight. Right?
He was a very close friend of mine, Steve, and he carried a tape recorder around. And if you would say something that was funny, he would say, this is October 13th, 1993. Shecky just said, yes. We'll use that if it fits into anything. Then he would be at dinner or something. He'd say, a little song came in my head. Oh, the dinner is delicious. The man is Jewish. He just served knishes. It's so very wonderful with a glass of wine. I want to eat here all the time. It just was unbelievable with that tape recorder.
Wow.
But let me tell you, not only was he most talented, they give credit to Johnny Carson and The Tonight Show. It's Steve Allen who created The Tonight Show. And before that, there was Jerry Lester,
And Dagmar.
And Dagmar. And it had a different name. It really was Steve Allen that made that show.
Well, the thing about Steve Allen is that I think it ran 15 minutes longer back then in the very beginning. If the show started sagging, he'd just go over and play piano.
He was not only a very talented, he was a brilliant man. I miss him. The way he died was a terrible thing. He had a little automobile accident, and then right after that, I don't know what happened. For some reason, because I started, with moose clubs and those type of things. But for some reason, and I did a lot of Jewish dialect things, but I became a Jewish comedian. Time magazine and Life magazine used to write me up as Borscht Belt comedian,
Well, were there any non-Jewish comedians in the whole scheme of things? What, 4 of them?
Yeah,
maybe?
Fred Allen. Fred Allen was,
yeah.
Fred Allen was. But he had Jewish friends,
Well, let me ask you about the Borscht Belt. It's my understanding that there were hotels up in the Catskills in New York where it was a lot cooler in the summer.
Oh yes.
And Jews from New York City, if they had the money to do it, would spend a week or so up in what became known as the Borscht Belt. Didn't almost every comedian of your generation perform
I don't know
there
of my
at
generation,
one time?
even before that. I worked there later. I started to make a little money, and the agent by the name of Charlie Rapp, who booked the Mountains, asked me to come up. And I was like getting a little bit more money than the guys that worked there for a long time, and because this guy liked me. And I got to really like that working at the Mountains. And what would happen when you would go, you'd go to work like at the Concord, and then you'd get off the stage and a cab would be waiting for you, and you get in a cab and you go to another place and you did another show. And that's the way it was for the weekend.
That sounds like the golden days of radio when some of these actors, Orson Welles, Hans Conried, would go from NBC to CBS back to ABC and then...
Well, that was the Mountains of the radio,
Yeah.
The things that are happening, people, you just flick a switch and you turn it,
Well, when I was first starting in radio, which was a long time ago, but in the scheme of things, not really, although radio's very new. There are people alive today who were alive before radio, as we know it today. But I remember if you send in a report from England...
I could tell a joke right now, but
go ahead.
Terrible joke. Yeah, I'm married to one. Go ahead.
You would send in a report from England on radio.
And it would be over the telephone and it sound like this.
Or short way before that. Now you got somebody in Baghdad on CNN, live camera. Beautiful audio. Beautiful picture. And I'm thinking, why did we open up telephones and stick clips on them? And but in my 50 years in broadcasting, and we were talking about the little recorder I'm using before we went on the air, technology... It isn't even, you could not have conceived of, but there's one constant, the microphones are still the same.
I'll tell you, the one thing that completely drives me insane is sound. And the microphone, when I do a show, I test it, and the guys still mess around with it, and I could tell it, But I'm very sensitive to that. And as you're talking about the microphone was like a god to me,
Well, I'll tell you, we were talking about karaoke before going on the air. I'm an okay singer, but I'll tell you, now and then, I do karaoke 2 nights a week at the same place. Now and then they don't have the mic right. And it's like, I don't know, it's like getting in a car you've never driven before or something. If it isn't perfect for me, probably the same thing you're thinking, I can't do it right.
Dennis, I got to tell you the greatest thing with me, with the microphones. For years, I worked clubs, and I would say to the sound man, you don't have it right. I'll tell you, turn it up, turn it this, and turn it, okay. That went on for years. One day, somebody says, did you ever get your ears, tested with the hearing aids, No. So I went and I got hearing aids. Put the hearing aids in, I wore them on stage. The sound became perfect. All those years, it was me. It wasn't them. So I got to go back 40 years now and find all these guys.
And apologize?
And apologize to every one of them. Listen, you remember that $15 I gave? It was really supposed to be $25. It's an amazing thing about me that I meet people now, and I'm shocked when they say, we saw you 20 years ago, we saw you 40 years ago, we saw you in Chicago, in New York. And it's hard to believe, that as your time goes on, it's hard to believe that you develop fans like that.
You leave Chicago, you go into the military because you had grown up in the Depression and then the war starts.
Yes.
When you're old enough, and Uncle Sam found out you were old enough. Or did you enlist?
No, I enlisted before I finished high school.
Oh, okay.
So I can get into the Navy.
That was 2 years worth?
A little over 2 years, yeah.
Then junior college, but you wanted to be a phys ed instructor?
Yes, but I said that when people say, what do you want to be? I'd say that,
Okay.
With a lack of saying anything else.
But did you play tennis, or were you naturally
I was
athletic?
a very good athlete.
Oh, okay.
5'7", but a very good athlete.
Now, I read somewhere that you then began to play small clubs and everything, but from what I have read, your big break was when you went to New Orleans. Do I have that right? That you played down there and were held over for 10 years or something?
No, I was I was held over, and then finally I left there, and they wanted me back. So the guy gave me part of the club. I had Al Hurt was my orchestra leader. Pete Fountain was in the band.
Good
Take
Lord.
a look who I had.
Yeah.
And I never had music, so when I left to go work in Miami after that, and the musician, the leader says to me, where's your music? I said, I don't have any music. He said, well, don't you do musical things? I said, yeah. He said, well, how do you do them? I said, well, Al Hurt did this, and Pete did this, and John and Freddie did this. He says,
they improvised?
Yeah, oh, sure. If I make up a song, they were right there.
Wow.
I mean, you couldn't have better musicians.
But these darn union musicians in Miami didn't grasp that, I suppose.
Well, let me tell you about what happened to me. They wanted young comics to work with Martha Raye at that time. And Martha Raye would come in there and would work, and then Martha Raye would use the material. I used to do a French routine, which was sensational. And next time I came back to work there, they said, you can't do that. Martha does that. And then something else, Martha does that, So, and that, I never had a love for those kind of people anyway. Martha Raye was very beloved by a lot of people, not by me, because I didn't have that. I had a girl once sitting, I put her at her table, and Martha bawled the hell out of me for putting this girl at the table.
Well, now, isn't there something to be said, though, about the fact that if you ad-lib stuff, if you're churning out material, you're ripe to be borrowed from? Because you're coming up with new stuff.
Let me tell you something. To explain that, that's how true that is. I do a joke. I say, I went to tell you something. I got to a 7-Eleven, and I bought this 7-Eleven, and this is the greatest 7-Eleven in the world. So now I walk in, and a guy says to me, I want to tell you, my brother's a very wealthy man now. He's got a 1422. I said, 1422, what's that? He says, 2 7-Elevens. Well, I told this joke, and then inside of a week, every comic in the world in Miami was using that joke, you know. And some that can't even do dialects, you know. You got to do a dialect in order to impress, to do the joke, you know, to punctuate the joke.
Well, it wouldn't work with a British accent.
Well, some guys would go, I own a 7-Eleven, and my brother owns a 1422. You know, it's not funny.
Do you know Johnny Carson stole the joke I wrote? It was just I and his writer inventing the same joke on the same day. The day Spiro Agnew was nominated to be Nixon's vice president.
Vice president.
I turned to a friend. I said, knock, knock.
Who's there?
Spiro Agnew.
Spiro Agnew who?
That's going to be his first problem. And that night on the Carson show, they used that. Well, the writer thought, you know.
Let me tell you, this kid Jay Leno, I did one of the first shows with him. I know Jay very well. And I would call him at time, and then as he was getting bigger, success does some strange things to people. He said, we don't need that joke because my writers and I have already come across that joke. I said, okay.
I'm riding around with Leno in the pace car at Indianapolis. Chevrolet had him come over, and of course he's Mr. Car. You know. So we're riding around, and I said, may I interview you while you're driving? Well, we're strapped into this Chevrolet something or other, and we're going around the track, and he's doing about 128, something like that. And I had the mic, and I asked him a question. I said, I really want to thank you. I hear you're very accessible, that if somebody needs an interview or has a charity function. And he turns and looks at me while he's driving. And I'm thinking, headline, Tonight Show host and journalist die in fiery pace car crash. But then he turns back around, makes the third turn at Indianapolis and the fourth turn. That was my one run-in with Jay Leno, but I thought I was going to die.
Well, I'm going to tell you about Jay Leno. Jay Leno, I didn't go to see these kids in the Comedy Stores and everything. Matter of fact, the Comedy Store, the original one, the Mitzi Shore had, I got for her. I went to the guy that owned the building and everything, and I got it. And I never was in it to see any of the comedians. Anyway, Jay Leno would always wear a shirt or a sloppy thing. I said, Jay, you're going on the Carson show. Do me a favor. Put on a jacket. Just put on a jacket. That's going to make the difference of everything, which eventually he did. And now, you know, he came out with the suits after they paid for him and all that stuff, which was the same thing that happened with Presley. When I worked with Presley at the Frontier Hotel, Presley came out in a baseball jacket. And then the scrim came down, and it looked like a lounge jacket. Matter of fact, a bad lounge jacket. So I went to Parker, and I said to Parker, Tom, he can't work this way. I said, he's got a 75-foot cutout of him in front of the hotel, and I says, playing the guitar, and you got to dress this kid. He can't come out dressed like a slob, you know, in his thing. You got to get and do something. So finally they went over to Liberace, and Liberace talked to him and told him what I said, and they fixed him with these clothes. And that's how he started wearing those clothes.
Can we define, before we get to your Vegas tenure, which is legendary, the difference between the lounge and the main room, specifically in the number of people? Am I right in saying you have a major star who's playing the main room and someone else in the lounge?
Well,
is it a pecking order that way?
You know, I'm 88 years old, so I can brag now.
Okay.
I was a major star in the lounge. Louis Prima was a major star in the lounge. Where people had to wait, where people were tipped more, the maitre d's retired quicker in the lounges than they did in the main rooms. I worked the lounge in the Riviera and places that they had nobody in the main room. Woody Allen was in the main room. There were 4 people in there. And he had some other acts with him that were pretty good, you know. And you couldn't get into my room. People that brought in the biggest money people, myself, Louis, Frank Sinatra, people like that. It's different, entirely different today. Tropicana Hotel was closed. I was working in the lounge at the Riviera. And I mean, you couldn't get into the Riviera lounge. They asked me to come over to Tropicana. I don't want to tell you who asked me, but some heavy people asked me about coming over there. It was closed. They said, we want you to work here. And they offered me a very good salary and 5% and a lot of paper for lawsuits. Then they begged me to come back to the Riviera, which was ready to close, was in the toilet. They brought me back to the Riviera, gave me a great salary, plus 2% of the hotel. Now, people don't know that, you know. When everybody said to me, 5%, I said, well, okay. So then I went in the lounge, and I says, we'll do this. And the guy that put up the money, J.K. Housels, didn't want me to fix up the lounge. He refused to do it. So I says, okay, forget about it. I'm going back to the Riviera. On the way out, I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put a board over the bar, and I'll work off of that. And then I went in, and I saved. I'm 88. I wouldn't tell you this at 87. But at 88, I will tell you, because I can be a little braggadocious. I saved that hotel and made it a success until the Folies Bergère came in. You understand? I never got the 5%, but I got a brand new car and a lot of paper for lawsuits. Then they begged me to come back to the Riviera, which was ready to close, was in the toilet. They brought me back to the Riviera, gave me a great salary, plus 2% of the hotel. But when everybody said to me, you're a lounge act, I don't know what that means. An entertainer is an entertainer. If he works in a box, if he works in a small room, he works in a big room, an entertainer is you can only sing one way in a big and small room. You can only tell jokes one way. So the comparison, when people say, they look on a guy that said, well, he worked in the lounge. Was there anybody greater than Louis Prima and Keeley in that lounge? Nobody. Nobody could touch that. I was introduced at a golf tournament not too long ago. And the guy said, we got one of the great lounge acts. Well, I'm doing this for nothing. I got so crazy. I got up, Dennis, and I ripped this guy a nubala tutta fazangala, whatever that means in Italian. And I said, let me tell you something. When you introduce an entertainer, introduce him as an entertainer. Don't say he worked in a lounge. Don't say he worked in a toilet. Don't say he worked in a big room.
Because, see, before you explained that, if you had said to me you were a lounge act, it would have rung the wrong bell with me. If you look up Vegas entertainment, you get 3 or 4 names, and you mention Louis Prima and Keeley Smith, and with Pete Barbuti, there was probably no more high energy of an act that ever played there. I mean, I watch films, I get tired watching them, of Louis, his act. But
everybody, I want to say, as the way we go, we're going to sing. Yeah, I worked in New Orleans with them.
But your name is always at the top or near the top of the list. To many people, even though you may have been a lounge act, you exemplify the new golden days of Vegas.
But Dennis, when I first went into Las Vegas, I wasn't what we call a lounge act. I went to work in the main room at the Last Frontier Hotel. I was the first act to be held over 16 weeks. Other people came in after that. Patty Andrews came in, Xavier Cugat came in. I stayed on with those shows. Never had an act. I never knew what I was doing from day to day. Never knew what I was doing until I started drinking there. Then I knew what I was doing. I was trying to get out of jail. From the Last Frontier Hotel, I went to the New Frontier Hotel. They signed me for that, and they signed me to a contract with the New Frontier Hotel and the Riviera Hotel. Same people. Now, when it comes time, they have no place to put me. Now, I'm living in Beverly Hills, California. Pretty expensive place to be living. I says, well, what are you going to do? You want to pay off this contract? No, so I said, I'll tell you what I'll do with you. My club in New Orleans was built like a lounge. There's that word again. Was built like a lounge. I says, put me in this room here, and I'll do my act. I says, nobody's ever done comedy in this place. I said, we'll do it. And that's how I started the comedy, doing it at the Riviera Hotel. And it became so successful, I cannot tell you.
Were you there? The answer's got to be yes, because you were there across a long period of years when the Rat Pack was in town.
Oh, sure. When the Rat Pack, sure. Okay. I thought it was the worst thing I've ever seen. It was so amateurish and so bad. And the thing they did with Sammy Davis, Smokey and Blackie, whatever they did, and the thing, forget about it.
It looks as if they're trying to figure out what to do. It looks as if they're trying to be cute and they don't know how.
Well, Sinatra tried to be funny, and Sinatra was not funny. Dean Martin had a funny bone. That's what we call a funny bone, right? Red Skelton used to say that.
I just want to say, Shecky, he's got a funny bone.
Frank Sinatra, in his best day, didn't have a funny bone. Try to be funny with saying things. Dean Martin, even when Dean was with Jerry, half the time people weren't even looking at Jerry. They'd be looking at Dean because Dean would come up with something cute, you know?
Well, that's what Jerry always says in documentaries, that Dean was so much funnier than anybody ever gave him credit for.
Oh, I thought he was great. You know what? They were crazy, and the people were not used to having craziness, like Jerry jumping up and him catching him, and that's what made him so great. The material was the worst, you know. And then he bothered Dean. Every time Dean sang a song, Jerry would jump in, you know. Everybody loves me, and I want to sing, you know. Wouldn't let him finish a song, you know. But I used to watch him, and I'd say, because my partner and I worked little toilets and everything, and we were 10 times better than them. But I watched that, and I said to myself, it's that energy, that wonderful thing that they got it, and a lot of people don't. And it's typical of great performers. There's something extra that you see in them. Other people could be doing the same thing, but that's that little thing that's energy, personality.
And they were so different.
Jerry had the ability, when he finally got into movies, he learned about the camera. Dean didn't care at all. Dean couldn't care less. Dean would rather be on a golf course. But Jerry studied, and he got to know about the camera. He got to know about the film. He got to know about these things. And that bothered Dean, because when Dean would come in to shoot or anything else, and Jerry would say, you know, Dean, what'd you do? Well, he didn't want to take that from Jerry. Dean was lazy. That's why Dean's success on the show. Dean never came to rehearsal and everything. That was...
he would come in and just kind of phone it in. I mean,
I did the show, and with Zero Mostel, we were singing a song from Damn Yankees, and he was going to come in and sing with us. He heard us singing so loud, he didn't want any part of it. It was what's his name, the producer of the show. Matter of fact, he took over Dean sold all the tapes and everything to him. But then what happened was that he would rehearse it, the producer and director, and Dean would come in, he'd tell Dean what he had to do. Dean didn't want to rehearse. And take a look how successful that show was.
Yeah, I think because he didn't panic, he looked as if he'd never rehearsed. He looked as if he just sat down, let's have some fun here for about an hour. It almost looks, well, it was spontaneous.
I was a partner in a hotel with him. I did 12 shows at NBC with him. I went to his house 3 times, and I don't think we said 3 words to each other.
Really?
I can't say he wasn't my kind of guy, because I thought that I was like him. I didn't want rehearsals. That's why when people say, do you think you could have been bigger? Well, maybe I could have been. I didn't want to leave the little nook that I had, where I was making a lot of money, and in Vegas and everything. I didn't want to do a movie. I hated doing movies.
You did a few.
Yeah, I did a few, but I hated the repetition. I hated that thing. I didn't want to leave that thing that I had. You know, when I did a television show, which became a big show, Combat, I sold Combat originally. I went out and I sold, that's before Vic Morrow and Rick Jason. So they were not even really on the show, but by the time we started putting that show together. I did 6 shows, and it was so bad being on the lot where there was the war and blowing up the tanks and this. I was in the Navy for 2.5 years aboard an aircraft carrier fighting the Japanese. I didn't see that much action, as I saw in the back lot of MGM. So I walked to the front and I said to the producer, I said, do you want to do me a favor? I don't want to be on this show anymore. I make X amount of dollars, $6,500 a week in Vegas. I said, I make it all as much as I want to, and I don't want this. This is not for me. So that's it. So people say, why didn't you do more of this, more of that? I didn't want to do more of that. And not only that, as I told you before, I used to have some heavy depressions, you know. I would do a show, people applauding more, and I'd get off the stage and start to cry. And the thing I was crying about, I didn't have any Kleenex to clean up. That's the thing I was crying about. You know.
Shecky, you were talking for a while about people you have come across, and one of them was Zero Mostel. I would have really loved to have interviewed that extremely frenetic man, Zero Mostel. Many people not only know him from A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum and the Broadway version of Fiddler on the Roof. There's also a tie between Zero and Carol Channing. when they both were relative unknowns, they actually did an improv together in New York. I really would have loved to have seen that.
I would have loved Carol Channing. That's another story. I hope you have another broadcast with me. It's another story with Carol Channing.
We have to do a show a week.
Okay, but Zero, let me tell you, I met Zero. He's a blustery, arrogant, talented, brilliantly talented, paints, magnificent painter, had an island of his own off of Maine where he painted, but he was a strange man, very strange man. I got to know him, and after we finished whatever we did, I said, do I like him or I don't like him? It's a question. I brought him, he liked special herring that my aunt made, and I brought him that, and he really, I don't think I ever remember him saying thank you,
Shaggy, what percentage of the well-known stars, radio, TV, movie, stage, were very different in person than the average fan might have thought? I mean, when I found out as a kid that Bing Crosby was a horrible father, I couldn't conceive of that.
He was a horrible father, but let me tell you something. He had horrible children, and Bing Crosby was one of my dearest friends, and I loved Bing Crosby, and I worked with Bing Crosby, and I knew those kids backwards, forwards, and in between, and they were no pleasure. He tried to do everything for those kids, but, with the news and everything else and what they make out of people.
I am so happy to hear you say that.
No, I love Bing Crosby.
Because I didn't want to remember Bing Crosby that way. I want to move on to two things I've always been curious about. What was it like to appear on The Tonight Show that first time? And then when you get the call and they say, Shecky, we want you to be host for a while or fill in on a night. Tell me about your Tonight Show experiences.
Well, it was in New York the first time that I did the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And I didn't think it was successful because I never really prepared. I did many Sullivan shows and never prepared. I didn't know that you had to prepare for them. I was that naive that I wouldn't sit down and write the material like I would now. I tell every young comic, when you get on that stage, know the first couple of things that you're going to say. Just don't go off the top of your head because it's not going to be there,
Well, and weren't Sullivan's people kind of paranoid because they're used to putting everyone in 5 minutes, 2 minutes?
No, because at the beginning that we did the Sullivan Show, they didn't ask what you were going to do. And they gave you, 8 minutes, Matter of fact, I'm the reason why Sullivan finally got a green room to interview all the comics coming on. I did a thing. He said to me one day,
Shecky, I don't have no 8 minutes for you, and I want you to do 2 minutes.
I said, Ed, I cannot do 2 minutes.
You can't say hello in 2 minutes.
No, I says, it's impossible.
Shecky, you want to be on his show? I want you to do 2 minutes.
So I went and I took a microphone apart and I did a piece. Matter of fact, they even show it on television now. I did a part with the microphone, and I turned the microphone upside down and I said, you imagine a mine disaster. And the miners are buried under tons and tons of coal. And one guy talking to the miner from up above says, you weren't hurt with soft coal. What's that? The bird died, that's a gas. Ridiculous type of things to eat up 2 minutes. As I'm walking off the stage,
he's you dirty rat, you just lost me Canada.
I was what?
Because of that mine disaster.
There was a mine disaster in Nova Scotia at the very minute I was doing this routine. Because it was live that we did it.
Good Lord, yes.
So he thought I did it because of that.
Well, in defense of Red Skelton, one of the things I constantly would hear him say in interviews is when you go into a town to do your routine, read the local newspaper. And he had a thing where he made a joke one time about the mayor's daughter. And the mayor's daughter in that town had just been brutally murdered.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so it's a good way to hang yourself.
And then Red Skelton finish it with,
oh, God bless.
Well, he had to.
God bless.
You and I talked about earlier about Red Skelton. They're just the people that you don't expect to do strange things end up doing strange things.
We also talked about Robin Williams and how here was a man whose brain ran at warp speed.
Oh.
Did you know anybody who was a comic genius who didn't have a dark side? Does it kind of go with the territory?
No, Lenny Bruce, if you want to consider Lenny Bruce, Buddy, who I think Buddy, when he did the old things,
Buddy Hackett?
Buddy was very bright and everything, and Buddy would go down into the toilet. Lenny Bruce went into the toilet. I don't know why. It's sort of a frightening thing when I think about it, because I think about that a lot. I think about my background as a child, the things that I were frightened of and everything. I mean, one day my father had a big job, in Chicago, and the next thing we were in a depression. He was out of work and everything. So from that time on, the electric bill wasn't paid, the gas bill wasn't paid. Certain things cause fear in you. You don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we're not born that way, but we develop those things. But later on, those are the things that I made humor out of. That I talked about the electric and the gas not being. I said, my mother kicked the greatest meal. We had it over and over again because we had no gas. She couldn't. We just kept on eating it out of this pot. It was the same thing over and over.
Well, to me, the storytelling comedian, the one who's not afraid to go 4 minutes to get the punchline, is interesting. And when you were saying that, Sam Levinson popped into my mind. He would get on some of these talk shows, and he'd go 8 minutes before he'd wrap this story. People wouldn't sit still for that now. But I did, too. I thought he was a wonderful man.
The comics used to come up to me and say, don't you get frightened that you don't get a laugh right away? I said, no, because I know at what time I get them. At what particular thing I'm doing, I mean, I could feel it. That audience is coming with me. It's like the weather changes. You feel that audience. And
well, Carol Channing in an interview told me that she used the word tentacles. That you have these feelers that go out, and even though the lights are so bright, you cannot see anybody. You can tell when they're with you. And it must be breathing or something or slight reactions. But she said it's a radar you have almost.
She's a very interesting lady, Carol Channing. Very interesting.
To get back to Skelton for a second, the way he fixed his humor, he laughed at his own stuff. I don't think there's ever been a comedian who was so amused by himself.
No, but if you want to know what's funny, a lot of guys developed that later on.
Is it a nervous laugh?
No, he really would. He would get a kick out of these things, But that was his personality to do that, And that's the way he got the audience. A lot of people would say to me, "Why does he laugh at his own things? I don't like that." Well, I says that's part of his. That's what his persona is. That's what his personality, and that I thought it very charming to see a grown man like this break up at this stuff. When he does the pigeons, you remember when he does
Gertrude and Heath?
Oh, Gertrude! Yeah. I mean, and then he'd make nothing better than that stuff.
I love the one quick routine. The two seagulls. The two seagulls, Gertrude and Heathcliff, are talking. I'm not going to do the voice, but one of them said, "Have you seen Charlie the pigeon?" I said, "Supposed to be here." Finally, Charlie flies in, no feathers. All his feathers gone. They say, "Charlie, what's happening?" He said, "I was flying over Beverly Hills. I got caught in a badminton match." What was it like that first night you hosted the Tonight Show?
Oh, so I hosted the show. Johnny asked me.
You were on 30 times or something.
Yeah, but let me tell you what's funny. Freddie DeCordova never once.
He was the director.
I never realized it until many years later. Never once came to me and said, "Come in the office and let's talk what you're going to do." He just threw me out there. I didn't like Freddie DeCordova. He was a society director that had no talent whatsoever. But Johnny liked him because I guess they had cigarettes together. He never once, and the director never came down and said to me, "Do you do this?" They threw me out. And they would give me the worst people. I had Robert Conrad one time. And
Dullsville.
No, but he was
arrogant?
Very mean.
Oh. Well, I think the company that hired him to do the battery commercial, he did these commercials where he had it on his shoulder.
Robert Conrad
said, "Knock it off my shoulder." I thought they probably realized that was his personality.
Well, I said to him as he walked out, I says, you and I are from the same city and everything. And he says, I don't want to talk about that. I came on to hear the music. So I turned to Freddie, the recorder, and I said to him, he don't want to talk, so let's put the music. I had the band play 3 songs.
Oh.
When it was spontaneous and they said, go do the show, I enjoyed it. But then when I had to prepare for it, that was not for me.
Ed McMahon told me one time that he saw The Tonight Show evolve to the point that every author who came on, every comedian, had to be debriefed first. And there would be talking points that they would really, Johnny would know what areas to ask about. You know, if the comedian had a story about a bad car, he would know and ask him about his car.
Yeah, you got to have some place to go, and you know. But I'm going to tell you, Johnny happened to have a special gift. He was extremely bright, and he had that Midwest, personality.
Well, and as we were saying, or maybe it was I, before we went on the air, I referred to that era not as The Tonight Show. I said something about you were on Johnny Carson.
That's right.
And that's the way we thought of that show.
But it's like the Ed Sullivan Show, the same thing. They didn't say, you were on television Sunday. It was you were on, and to be on the Ed Sullivan Show, forget about it, you made it. Boy, how many times you do the Ed Sullivan Show? 3 times. 3 times, my gosh,
Yeah, Della Reese told me that she was on 9 times in 1 year because Sullivan's wife liked her. And she would say, now, Sylvia, Eddie, let's have Della Reese back on again.
Sylvia, his wife, he used to say to Sylvia, why do we dislike Shecky Greene? And she would tell him, because of the mine disaster. So I'm in Florida one time, and we get on an elevator. And he walks into the elevator, and he wants to get off because I'm on the elevator. And he says, Sylvia, why do we like this Shecky Greene? I says, because of the mine disaster.
You never live that down.
Oh, God. And yet at the end, I was with him right at the end. Can I tell you something? He was at Mo Lewis's house in Las Vegas, and I was with him at the end. There was nobody around him or anything.
Really?
And we became very close friends.
In doing research, I found out, and I wasn't old enough to realize, how big a star Ed Sullivan was.
Oh,
he did all the celebrity interviews, yeah. And yet, I, growing up in the Midwest, I just saw him as this odd, stiff-backed, and then Will Jordan did the most incredible
he did.
imitation of Ed. And Ed would stand there and watch him. That was the fun thing about it.
Before we leave, I got to tell you about that. Ed Sullivan had the 11th anniversary of the Ed Sullivan Show. He said, Shecky, I'm going to bring you into New York. You're going to do my anniversary show. Says, okay. So I'm thinking what I'm going to do and everything else. So I get there and I said to him, Ed, introduce me as a German comedian. When your travels to Europe, before you came, you met a young German comedian, in Frankfurt. Well, did I meet a young comedian? I said, no, you didn't meet a young comedian. I'm the young comedian, and you'll introduce me as Charles Furtz, whatever name. He said, in other words, I'm going to introduce you as German comedian. I said, yeah. So I come out and I said, ladies and gentlemen, he introduced me as a German comedian. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say it's a pleasure being on Mr. Sullivan's show. I says, Mr. Sullivan, it's been 11 years on this show, and I applaud. Isn't this great? And the people say, why has he been on 11 years? Because he doesn't sing, he doesn't dance, he doesn't tell jokes, he don't do nothing. That is why he's been on 11 years. And well, he got so crazy. After that show, he's waiting for me. He says, Shecky, I want to tell you something. I have more talent in my little finger than anybody I've ever had on this show. As you sick old son of a whatever, I said. You really believe that? He says, yes. I said, Ed, and it was all dark backstage. I said, I'm going to leave you here, and I want you to sit down and think about what you said to me. And somebody was waiting for me to go see Plume de Matante that night, and they were waiting. They were getting all nervous. I said, I got to leave. But you imagine, I get more talent in my...
The man had an ill-conceived concept of his own abilities, didn't he?
Because he was that big, became that... You know how he got the show? Do you know how he got the Ed Sullivan Show?
It was called Toast of the Town, I remember, before it went network. But how he got the show, no, huh?
Okay. The Harvest Moon Festival used to have dancers.
Now, the Harvest Moon Festival, for those of us who grew up in Indiana, was what?
Was a dance contest.
Okay.
In New York, in Chicago, all the big cities. And these people, then finally they one city against the other in every case. And they would go out, Milton Berle would go out as the MC, and he used to do the show. He would introduce them and do his things, whatever he did. One year he couldn't do it, and he says, why don't you get Ed Sullivan? And they went to theaters, they went to vaudeville. So Berle emceed the show. He couldn't do it, and he says, why don't you get Ed Sullivan? Ed Sullivan did some stuff, so they got Ed Sullivan to do the thing. Because of Ed Sullivan doing those theaters with the thing, somebody said, why don't we put on a vaudeville show that let Ed Sullivan do the thing? That's how Ed Sullivan got that show.
Because essentially that's what the show was. It had everything
a
from
vaudeville
Robert
show.
Merrill to Dancing Bears.
Yeah, it was a vaudeville. But that's how he got the show. It was because of Berle brought him on for the Harvest Moon Festival.
Wow.
Right here doing a tango is Maxis Sanagilikitu.
I remember one night that really showed me it was live television. It was Sergio Franchi or some singer comes down a flight of steps and he stops and he says, Ed, I'm sorry, I can't hear the orchestra. May we start this again? And Block, what was his name? Was the orchestra? Ray Block. So he goes back up to the top of the steps, and so they started again, and I thought, boy, that is live, isn't it?
That was live at that time.
Yeah.
But later on, no. Later on,
they would have fixed it. They would have taken it out of the tape.
I did, with the mine disaster, we would have killed less miners.
Shecky Greene, one final question. If you could, and you say at age 88 now, you just don't give a darn about anything. If you could pick one night or one venue out of your career to go back to for one night, what would that be? You had a lot of good times.
Yeah, but I'm going to tell you something. Dennis, I in the thousands of shows I did, I couldn't say, no, not one could I pick out.
Is there one that you wouldn't? Maybe it was the mine disaster.
There's many that I wish I didn't do, But those I remember very well. But there isn't one. There was something that it gave to me that I guess I needed it. I love to see people laugh. I go now, I'm in every supermarket, I do a show. Every store that I go in, I sing songs. I ask the girl what her name is, Eileen. Eileen, would you listen to Shecky Greene? I would love to take it to a place. No matter where I go to, I sing and I do this. And it's such a joy to get these people. When I walk into a place, they say, here comes a singer, So,
well, you're going to live forever, though, so you have that attitude.
If I live forever, I will promise you I'll remember all the jokes I used to do.
I know you've already had offers, but you got to go to karaoke with me some night.
I would love it.
Okay.
I would love it. Do you win prizes, though?
No, that's the darn thing. Now, if you want to go down to the Ace Hotel, which I will tell people is a hotel in my neighborhood, on Monday nights they have game night, 7 to 9, free bingo. And if you do the coverall, you get a $50 gift certificate.
No, I don't.
Then they
that.
do trivia at 9.
Yeah.
And yours truly has won 8 out of the last 11 weeks.
Of trivia?
Yeah, but you do newscasts for 50 years, and you pick up a lot of stuff. Shecky Greene, this has been great fun. We really need to do this again. Between the time you and I spent before we went on the air, I've been here a week now, haven't I?
Well, my wife called while we were on and everything else. I think we're getting a divorce. But she's in Las Vegas right now.
Shecky, thank you very much.
Dennis, thank you for coming over, and thank you for asking me to do it.
And thank you for the fried rice.
Okay. Don't tell your doctor.
No. Shecky Greene has done so many things during his career, growing up in the northern section of Chicago and then going away to the Navy during World War II, thinking he wanted to be a phys ed instructor, finally being discovered, and being one of the most durable comedians in American history. What a great thrill to finally sit down with a man I've admired for a very, very long time. Shecky Greene. I hope you enjoyed this interview from my new American Montage series. Check out YouTube for more. I'm Dennis Daly.